Good evening, and welcome to SkepTalk, the monthly speaker series hosted by the Bay Area Skeptics. Before tonight's presentation, a few words about Bay Area Skeptics. As North America's oldest skeptical organization, we are dedicated to promoting critical thinking, logic, and rational thought. In the 1970s and 80s, scientists such as Carl Sagan and magicians such as James Randi established the scientific skepticism movement out of concern about the popular fondness for pseudoscience and the lack of public science literacy. Scientific skepticism embraces evidence-based civil discourse on health, education, consumer protection, and especially the investigation of extraordinary claims. Using the scientific method, we hope to promote skeptical inquiry to reduce irrational thinking in society. This talk is supported by Bay Area Skeptics members such as you. Please visit us at baskeptics.org or join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Meetup. Consider supporting us through convenient monthly donations via Patreon. Patrons receive premiums such as discounts and free t-shirts for our annual Skeptical Conference. But more importantly, members help us make the world just a little more reasonable and rational. And now, tonight's speaker.
Good evening. I'm Eugenie Scott. I'm president of Bay Area Skeptics. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Jenny Rice, professor of writing, rhetoric, and digital studies. Hope you all noticed the Oxford comma in there, at the University of Kentucky. Her PhD is from the University of Texas, Austin, in English, with a specialty in rhetoric. She's published 2 books and numerous articles and reviews in the professional literature, and also teaches a course in the rhetoric of pseudoscience. You might have heard her on the skeptical podcast, Oh No, Ross and Carey, which I found very interesting. Rhetoric is defined as the art and science of effective persuasion and communication. In her first book, Distant Publics, Jenny analyzed the rhetoric involved in controversies over urban development and how participants in controversies rhetorically framed and promoted their views. The role of rhetoric in shaping arguments is highly relevant to skepticism, but it's even more arguable that rhetoric provides a window on why people believe the way that they do. Her book, Awful Archives, gets into this directly, and we'll hear more of her views on this topic tonight, especially the role of evidence. Do your own research, of course, is a mantra of many people who believe they have discovered evidence for what the rest of us would consider highly suspect. Briefly, though, her book is described as, quote, examining the strange and the fringe in order to explore the life world of what we call evidence. Now, I have a soft spot for the University of Kentucky, although frankly, only monsters would put a hulking concrete tower right next to a graceful old 19th century building like Old Main. That's Patterson, which, alas, I found out that unfortunately is where Jenny has her office. I began my academic career at the University of Kentucky in anthropology in the mid-1970s, where I became a friend of a young professor in the English department, Joe Nickell, whom anybody who reads the Skeptical Inquirer will be quite familiar with. I also got to know the late psychologist Robert Baker, a member of the CSI pantheon of skeptics, who was a well-known investigator of UFOs and general all-around debunker of the paranormal. So maybe there's something about the social sciences and humanities at UK that encourages critical thinking and examination of extraordinary claims. I kind of doubt it, though, but whatever. Nonetheless, Jenny Rice is carrying on a proud UK tradition of thinking about why people believe in weird things, as Michael Shermer would say. But in researching her bio for this presentation tonight, I discovered that before coming to UK, she taught at the University of Missouri. I got my PhD at the University of Missouri. Coincidence? I'll let you think about that. Jenny, welcome to the Bay Area Skeptics. We're so glad to have you here tonight.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I can't wait to talk with you sometime about all those connections. They're really fascinating.
Yeah, it's true. UK really does have this this a whole lot of people who think like we do have wandered through UK over the years. I'm really interested in this idea of the various ways that evidence is looked at by various parties, because just in, I confess I have not read your book. I apologize. I want to get it though. But just in reading the various descriptions of it and the very positive reviews, it's clear that the word evidence has very different meanings for many of us. So let us just leap right in and have you tell us about evidence. And oh my gosh, here I've forgotten the title of your talk today. Well, it doesn't matter. What does evidence do? Yes, we got it. Go for it.
All right. Thanks. Thank you so much, and thanks for everybody who's watching and joining. So I'll give you a little more background, sort of how I got here. As Judy said, I study rhetoric, and specifically public argument and how we come to make claims and evaluate them, persuade others. And probably like many people watching, or most of you, I'm very interested in extraordinary claims, which means that I'm also interested in extraordinary evidence. So about 10 years ago, I would say, I started becoming really interested in conspiracy rhetoric as sort of a particularly wild example of public rhetoric. And this was, when I began this was prior to the 2016 election. And so at that time, I remember thinking, I'm not really sure that anybody's going to be that interested in a book on conspiracy theories. I wasn't sure if there was this was the right time for it. And unfortunately, it became more relevant than I could have imagined. As a person who studies, public discourse, public debate, I was really fascinated by the way that conspiracy discourse kind of flies in the face of Enlightenment era ideals about how persuasion works or should work, that somebody makes a claim and then offers evidence for that, and then an audience evaluates that evidence and then perhaps offers counter evidence. It's all very rational, but most of us know that that's not really how things tend to go. So when I started research for my book, I began researching particularly with 9/11 truthers. At the time, that was one of the largest and most organized conspiracy groups. And I was able to attend several conferences, conventions, meetups. So there were quite a lot of them at the time. So during one of these conventions that I went to, I sat next to a man who struck up a conversation with me. And he handed me at the time this sort of phony dollar bill, which is here, that had the words, 9/11 on it. And then in smaller print around the edges, it had words like the Gulf of Tonkin, vaccine manufacturer, New World Order, Bilderberger. And he handed this to me. And then he asked me what brought me to the conference. And I answered very honestly. I said that I was there researching, although I did tend to, how I phrased it was that I was researching alternative theories, which was true, but I was very careful not to use the term conspiracy theorist. But I said I was very interested in sort of this alternative research that they were doing. And then came the inevitable question where he asked, what do you think of 9/11? And I told him very honestly that I had worked in bureaucracies for a very long time, spending most of my life in public universities, enough to know that nothing goes off in a bureaucracy without a hitch. And on top of that, it's much easier for me to believe that a giant bureaucracy like the US government suffers from massive failures in communication, intelligence exchange, than it is for me to believe that they have seamless communication pipelines. And I explained that I also have context about sort of, historical quasi-political actors with, long-standing ideological grievances against the United States, and basically was saying, I tend to believe the mainstream narrative. And the more I talked, just the more his face fell, and he just looked disgusted with me. And as we were talking, he began to pull out all kinds of, papers and pamphlets and notes that he was handing to me, and he was explaining about nano-engineered particles and the properties of red thermite and what all that means about the third tower that fell. And I'm sure that I smiled and nodded, but at some point, my face just sort of glazed over until he said something that I wasn't quite expecting. He said, "How can you just believe something when you have no evidence whatsoever to back up your claim?" And I don't remember my response to him, but I do remember clearly thinking, what the fuck? I'm sitting here at a conspiracy theory conference talking to someone who finds my claim not only extraordinary, but thinks I lack any evidence whatsoever for it. And then again, I didn't have a bag full of documents and notebooks and all kinds of information about every aspect about 9/11. I hadn't studied the physics of how buildings fell. I even hadn't read the entire 9/11 Commission report. I had skimmed it, or had skimmed the executive summary at least. Did I have evidence to back up my belief? Did he? And it seemed to me that answering either one of those questions is a simple yes or no is very unsatisfying and incomplete, especially to me as a rhetoric scholar. I wasn't really satisfied with sort of saying yes or no to either one of those. And so that incident really stuck with me for a long time, and it kind of became this driving anecdote throughout my entire project. And it left me with this one question that I thought shouldn't be hard for me to answer, which is, what is evidence? And what I came to discover the more I got into this project and writing was that maybe that's the wrong question to ask. Maybe a better question to ask is, what does evidence do? And so that's kind of what I want to talk about tonight, how we might shift a way of thinking about evidence. And I want to explain maybe why I think that shift can be useful. So this incident with my conference buddy, it led me to see some flaws with the way that certain scholars who study conspiracy theory sometimes talk, especially about conspiracy logic. So, for example, in a very widely cited 2009 essay called "Conspiracy Theories, Causes, and Cures," Cass Sunstein and Adrian Vermeule say this: those who hold conspiracy theories typically do not do so as a result of mental illness of any kind or of simple irrationality, but as a result of a crippled epistemology in the form of sharply limited number of relevant informational sources. So the cure that they recognize or propose then is that we should increase the amount of available information sources to people who sort of dabble in conspiracy theories. So, for example, they recommend infiltrating like online discussion boards where conspiracy discourse is happening in order to sort of provide better multiple sources of information. And now, with all due respect to them, I tend to think that the last thing that conspiracy theorists need is more information sources. And that might sound counterintuitive or cynical. When you hear someone shouting about how jet fuel can't melt steel, it seems to make sense to provide facts, scientific facts about thermodynamics, or the fact that, in fact, jet fuel burns hot enough to, weaken steel to such an extent that a building structure is fatally compromised. And that would explain but if you've spent any time at all reading about, talking with conspiracy theorists, that this kind of response can be sort of a dead end. There's plenty of examples about how rational, sound evidence that's offered up to conspiracy theorists become kind of sucked into this cognitive dissonance machine. It can be dismissed as disinformation or planted misdirection. And this isn't a new turn in, it's like 21st century conspiracy rhetoric. In 1939, a literary theorist and a rhetorician named Kenneth Burke wrote an essay for the Southern Review called The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle. And it was amazingly prescient for the time. Burke primarily based his analysis on Mein Kampf, where Burke says he found this troubling logic at work. And here's a great quote from Burke. He says, if you point out the enormous amount of evidence to show that the Jewish worker is at odds with this idea of the international Jews stock exchange capitalist, Hitler replies with 100% certainty, aha, that's one more indication of the cunning with which the Jewish plot is being engineered. So Burke's pointing out here that Hitler's argument basically could withstand any counter evidence because that counter evidence is just simply absorbed into this ever-growing archive of anti-Semitism. So evidence begets evidence, creating this sort of evidentiary abundance. And much the same thing happens today. So for those who think that COVID is a hoax and that vaccines are a trick, for those people, all the loads of scientific data coming from experts don't tend to assail that belief. Instead, it's more like, well, isn't it curious that the government's trying so hard to convince us otherwise? We must be on the right track. So the more scientific evidence comes out from Dr. Fauci, the more it seems like they're trying so hard, we must be right to begin with. So, obviously cognitive dissonance and things like confirmation bias are playing roles here. But I'd also like to call attention to something else that I think that's happening here. And just about a decade after Kenneth Burke wrote that essay, The Rhetoric of Hitler's Battle, social theorist Theodor Adorno and his colleagues published The Authoritarian Personality, which shares results from a very lengthy study around one single question, which is what drives fascism? And Adorno and his colleagues, for very different reasons, were very interested in anti-Semitic attitudes among Americans at the time. So this is just after World War II. And for the most part, Adorno and his the social theorists had actually escaped Hitler's Germany at the time. And so they conducted numerous surveys among average American citizens in order to gauge respondents' agreement or disagreement with various opinions and beliefs about Jews. So the survey questions that they designed were meant to study two popular forms of anti-Semitism. One belief that Jews are too seclusive, meaning they're extremely insular, and then another belief that Jews are too intrusive, meaning that they're overly assimilated with non-Jews in what was then perceived as very threatening ways. So some of the questions about the seclusive character of Jews include statements such as, no matter how Americanized a Jew may seem to be, there's always something basically Jewish underneath. A loyalty to Jewry in a manner that is never totally changed. Or the Jews keep too much to themselves instead of taking the proper interest in community problems and good government. So questions like these, and respondents were asked if they agreed or disagreed. That was the seclusive. The respondents were also asked to rate their agreement or disagreement with statements about Jews' intrusive character. And these questions were things like, Jews go too far to hide their Jewishness, especially such extremes as changing their names, straightening noses, imitating Christian manners and customs. Or one thing that's hindered the Jews in establishing their own nation is the fact that they really have no culture of their own. Instead, they try to copy the things that are important to the native citizens of whatever country they're in. So the sort of logical thing to say here, and we would be reasonable to assume that people who agree that Jews are too reclusive and antisocial probably aren't also going to agree that Jews are way too assimilated and too social. But this actually isn't what the results found. So Adorno and his colleagues discovered that respondents quite easily held both beliefs at the same time. Jews are both overly seclusive and reclusive, and overly assimilated and too much a part of the, other part of the community. So, for example, a surprising number of respondents who agreed that, quote, rich Jews help their own people but not American causes, also agreed with the statement that, quote, Jews donate money only out of prestige for desire and only out of desire for prestige and fame. So the way that the authors put it is that, this is a quote from them, there's a deep contradiction in anti-Semitic ideology. As a matter of simple logic, it is impossible for most Jews to be both extremely seclusive and aloof, and at the same time, too intrusive and prying. So in other words, like, the respondents who mistrusted Jews seem to find them guilty as charged, no matter what the charge is. And usually when we have two competing ideas rattling around in our head, cognitive dissonance kind of kicks in and, takes care of one somehow, one way or the other. But not here exactly. And so what Adorno and company argue is that these contradictory beliefs are very comfortably woven together by a single overarching ideological umbrella, which is just something like Jews are bad news. And what weaves these contradictions together is what the authors call a nuclear idea that allows all negative beliefs about this thing to exist peacefully, even if they're contradictory. The seemingly paradoxical beliefs are not mutually exclusive, but as they put it in The Authoritarian Personality, the contradiction is complete. And here's a longer quote from them. Once the central or nuclear ideas are formed, they tend to pull in numerous other opinions and attitudes to form a broad ideological system. And this system provides a rationale for any specific idea within it and a basis for assimilating new social conditions. So imagine that, for example, imagine you're sitting at a wobbly table, as I actually was earlier today, in fact. And it's always the most annoying thing, right? When you're sitting at a table, maybe across from somebody at a restaurant, let's just say, and then the table's wobbling. Your drink knocks around the table, sloshes everywhere. We've all done this. And the inclination that you have, which is the inclination I had earlier, was to grab something, stick it under the table. You might grab a wad of napkins, as I did earlier, stabilize the leg, or you might take a page out of the magazine that you happen to be reading and fold it neatly and stick it under there. Or you might be so desperate that you take the book that you're reading and slide it under the table leg to end the frustration. It doesn't really matter which of these options you choose, because they all do the job of stabilizing that table. And in much that same way, this metaphor, what Adorno and friends call the nuclear idea is kind of something like that wedge underneath a wobbly table. It doesn't matter which claims stabilize the nuclear idea. It's the overall solidity of that anti-Jewish ideology that matters. It's the overall solidity of the table that matters. So, interestingly enough, about 5 decades really after The Authoritarian Personality was published, there's a similar study conducted by researchers who were interested specifically in conspiracy theories. And researcher Michael Wood and his colleagues, they shared the results of this study in an essay called Dead and Alive, Belief in Contradictory Conspiracy Theories, which revealed that conspiracy theorists often possess contradictory beliefs about a single conspiracy theory. So in a questionnaire that's kind of similar to the one in the authoritarian personality, researchers found that the more participants believe that a famous person at the center of a death-related conspiracy theory, like Princess Diana or Osama bin Laden, the more that they believe that they are alive still, the more they also tend to believe that the same person had been killed through some kind of official conspiracy. So, for example, Osama bin Laden, people would say there was a high agreement that they suspected that Osama bin Laden was secretly alive for some reason. But then they also tended to agree at the same time that bin Laden had already been killed by the time SEAL Team 6 arrived on the scene, and there was some kind of cover-up. So now you see why they get to their essay's title, Dead and Alive. Now, logically, bin Laden is either dead or alive, and a single conspiracy theory can't account for both facts at once. Has to be one or the other, right? So it's rational to eliminate one of these alternatives in order to remove a significant cognitive dissonance. But here's what Wood and his colleagues found. They found that these competing viewpoints are united in support of what they call a conspiracist worldview about secrecy within the government. So the individual version of conspiracy, or the individual, pieces of it, dead, alive, they're sort of beside the larger point, which is that there's nefarious secrecy at work. And both of those things, whether he was already killed when SEAL Team 6 came in, or that we have him kept captive somewhere, he's still alive, both of those sort of, again, are sort of the wedge underneath this belief that the government's hiding something in relation to him. So Wood writes, this is a quote from Wood, "The specifics of a conspiracy theory don't matter as much as the fact that it is a conspiracy theory at all." So this kind of brings me to the shift in evidence that I was mentioning at the beginning. Instead of asking what evidence is as a thing, I'm wondering if maybe we should start asking what it is that evidence does. In other words, it's thinking of it less as a thing than an action. So less of a noun, more as a verb. And for the most part, we tend to think about evidence as a thing. We talk about it as being present or absent or real or fake. And we ask questions like, is all the evidence in, or have we found the evidence, as if it's like a lost UPS package? It's pretty common. But what's important to me to recognize is that this hasn't always been the way that evidence has been conceptualized. So it hasn't always been about its thingness has not always been the hallmark of how we think of evidence. So in some of the earliest treatises on argument, Quintilian, the Roman rhetorician, he connects the Latin term for evidence there's the Latin evidentia, and he connects that to the earlier Greek term energia. So he, obviously the Latin term that he uses, evidentia, from which we get evidence. He says, I'm translating this from the Greek energia. But what's important is that both of these terms, evidentia and energia, signify things like vividness, or bringing before the eyes, or the sense of conjuring images. They have the connotation of enacting a kind of feeling. Or historian Carlos Ginzburg describes it as, quote, an uncanny capacity to use words to conjure up absent realities. And in fact, many of the terms that we now translate from either the Greek or the Latin as evidence, the word evidence, those earlier terms from Greek and Latin, they do have a sort of decidedly mystical or maybe just less solidified sensibility to them. So, for example, the term that Aristotle uses for proof, by which he means, when he says proof, he means that which demonstrates a claim, which we would say is evidence. The term that he uses for proof is the Greek term pistis. And pistis is mostly well known now to scholars of the New Testament, because it is that term that is often translated as faith. And so there's a lot of very, for obvious reasons, they're very interested in this term, but the New Testament use of the term pistis for faith really is borrowed from an even older sense of pistis. And obviously the ancient Greek rhetorical context didn't carry a religious connotation to it. However, it does have a kinship to a realm that falls outside of what we might neatly call rationality, and it has more to do with feeling. And this is, I just thought this image was very interesting. I saw this on Etsy for some reason, which I thought was, I'm not sure who's buying this type of thing, but it is sort of shows you the origins of pistis and means faith. I just thought that was a really fascinating thing you could buy on Etsy. But all of this is just to say that evidentia, that term, but as a concept that we kind of get from Greek and Roman rhetoric, really is a matter of evocation. So less of a thing, more of an act, and specifically an act of sort of sensibility. It's very sense heavy. So getting back to that wobbly table just for a second and its wedges, there is a distinction, obviously, that we can make between the various stuff underneath each of these table legs and what those things are doing. So it might be interesting to focus on the actual makeup of whatever's wedged underneath that table. So did you happen to study the table with the book I just gave you as a birthday present and now is sitting underneath the table leg? Because perhaps we should talk about that. That's of interest. Or did you just use a page out of the magazine that I was reading and you didn't even ask me? Then perhaps we would talk about that too. Or did you use the last of the napkins on the table? Each of those might be very relevant and interesting in conversation. But beyond that, there's questions beyond just sort of the material contents of these wedges. We can also talk about what are they doing? So whatever, regardless of whether it's the book I just gave you that you've callously stuck underneath the table leg or the magazine or the whatever, the wedge is making the table more steady. So perhaps it's making this date less awkward because now I'm not spilling things all around, or, it's allowing me to draw without, sort of messing up or write on a table. So in much the same way, we can also see evidence as something more than just the sum of its contents, factual contents, pseudo-factual contents. It's doing something. So details about nanothermite at the World Trade Center, or factoids about 5G towers emitting toxic energies, or still film images of a boom mic accidentally appearing on the moon landing video. They may seem like nonsense to us. I would say they're nonsense. But at the same time, they are making a sense. You're making sense, not in the ways that we might use it in terms of rationality, but they are literally making a sense for people, which is important to recognize that they're producing something, they're evoking something. So when we talk about evidence, then it's possible to start thinking about evidence along this kind of double register as contents, the actual thing underneath the table wedge, and the action. So when we hear extraordinary claims that are being made by conspiracy theorists, we have a choice between a kind of doing a forensic breakdown of what exactly is crammed underneath the table leg, so to speak, or look at what is being accomplished. What is the action, the stabilization, and what happens as a result of the stabilization? Another way of getting at this is perhaps by asking a different set of questions. For example, we could ask, what is being referenced? What is the reference of this evidence? And here, I tend to look to David Hume, good old David Hume. He's pretty helpful here, I think, in this regard. Hume makes a distinction between what he calls sentiment and judgment. And I have always liked this quote very much because it's quite helpful. Hume says, all sentiment is right because sentiment has a reference to nothing beyond itself, and it's always real. But all determinations of judgment are not right because they have a reference to something beyond themselves, to wit, to real matters of fact, and are not always comfortable to that standard. So, as Hume points out, it's really nearly impossible to argue with claims of sentiment because those are claims of aesthetics, right? And sentiment, palpable senses, then are always true in some way, in at least insofar as they're not falsifiable, at least not in the same way that matters of judgment are. It's sort of like when I joke with my kids when they say that they like a particular TV show or song, and I jokingly say, I'm sorry, your opinion is incorrect. And we laugh because no opinion is incorrect, right? That's the beauty of opinion. But for that reason, because it's not falsifiable, it references something else. It references taste. It references my like, how it makes me feel. That's what it's referencing. But if I happen to make a claim of fact about the year that a certain movie came out, that obviously is referencing something beyond my like or dislike of that particular movie or song or whatever. So I was thinking about this quote by Hume, which strangely enough, I think about quite a bit. I was reminded of this quote a few years ago when I came across an essay by two conspiracy theory researchers named Ian Reyes and Jason K. Smith. And this is a kind of a lengthy quote from them, but I happen to like it very much. They say, the perfection of a conspiracy theory does not come from achieving the status of scientific knowledge or historical fact. Rather, as an adversary to these modes, the best conspiracy theory is one that most powerfully deploys conspiracism as an aesthetic end unto itself. Therefore, the goal of conspiracism lies not in dialectically refining its research program to match the methods of its critics, but in constantly revising its arguments in the interest of maintaining the spin, oscillation, or blur that is the hallmark of conspiracist aesthetics. So, in other words, in conspiracy rhetoric, it's sort of that ongoing work of amassing anecdotes, information, documents, and artifacts that can become its own goal. Maintaining the ongoing work of sort of steadying a table that's always on the verge of wobbling, the work of constantly maintaining this, umbrella, this nuclear idea, whatever that is, the reference beyond itself. So, what does this mean for public discourse, especially public discourse that is awash in false claims and fake news and conspiracy theories and so forth. So when I was writing my book and I was finishing it up, I tended to hear some of these questions, especially the question, so what do we do? How do we debate conspiracy theorists? How do we argue with people who are loaded down with bad evidence? And my answer then, and actually my answer now as well, always seems to be a little disappointing, I think, to people, because I usually end up saying the one thing that nobody's really looking for, which is that you don't. You don't. And of course, this answer contains a multitude of caveats. To say that debating isn't productive doesn't mean that response is impossible or unproductive. Response and debate are two different things. The emphasis on debate, I think, very often focuses on the contents of that wedge, right? The thing, the content of it, the truth, the falsity of it. And to borrow a phrase from political economist William Davies, I do think we've put too much faith in a kind of bravado rationalism, which is his phrase, or that insistence that rational counterargument is the only effective response to really troubled, warrantless claims. And I get it, because I've also felt the thrill that comes from such bravado, from pointing out factual inconsistencies or fallacious reasoning, or delegitimizing shoddy sources, or exposing logical flaws. We've all done it. There's a certain sort of, there's a rush that you get from it, but I don't know that it's productive in a larger sense. There's certainly times that such tactics are crucial, but there are limitations to a rhetorical response that only seeks to prove or disprove the validity or legitimacy of another person's evidence. So rather than drawing a very limited circle around the contents of a claim, we might instead ask, what is being evoked? What is being conjured through this act of evidence? What is that larger nuclear idea being supported here? What is the reference of this evidence? What is this evidence pointing to? And so I think that these kinds of questions are ways of potentially shifting our energies and our resources, actually, in terms of how and who we respond to in those moments. And at the very least, my hope is that we'll continue to examine this thing, as strange as it is, called evidence, something that I thought when I first started my book, I had a very good handle on, having studied rhetoric for quite a long time, and then coming to find out it's really not that straightforward. So because I do think extraordinary claims do require extraordinary evidence, but I also think extraordinary evidence calls for extraordinary claims as well. And that's, I will end there. And I can't see anybody, but I thank you very much for listening.
I think we're back. Thank you. Thank you. You've given a lot of things for us to chew on right now. I know we're going to, Jay is going to provide us with some questions from the people watching this on YouTube. But while he's doing that, and just give me a chance to ask a few questions. You started out your talk by mentioning that you had attended that one conspiracy conference. Did you attend very many of them? I mean, in your research?
Yes.
Poor soul, have you done this a lot?
Yeah.
Tell us what it's like, because I think most people have never done that.
And I also did. I mean, I did a combination. I feel like I sort of lived this in sort of different ways. So I did a lot of interviews, but I also attended sort of local meetups, sort of more regional groups. But But at the time, and this was, I'm trying to think of the years, maybe around 2013, 2014 that I was doing this. There were much larger sort of national conventions.
Mhm.
And you would tend to get some of the same speakers. And it was very interesting for me because I had already in my mind this idea of, conspiracy theorists around, say, like 9/11. I had this idea they're very homogenous, and then come to find out, oh, no, there's huge, it's a very diverse group, not only just like demographically, but in terms of what they believe. So they themselves are sort of debating. Me from an outsider, I'm thinking, I don't believe any of this is
Right.
very sound, but they're debating with each other about the validity and soundness of the evidence. Some of it is, very, very technical, and I found that out very quickly. Some of it is, sort of, it was, I had an anecdote that I wrote about during one interview that I did with one of the conference organizers. And the interview very, very quickly delved into a very strange anti-Semitic rant. And he, stopped in the middle of this and said, "Are you Jewish?" And I said, "I am." And I wasn't really sure how to proceed. And it was these types of moments I thought, I'm not really sure what I've gotten myself into here, but it was also at the same time that I thought, I really want to understand what's happening, because I've studied rhetoric and persuasion, and all the tools that I've had and that I teach students don't seem to be operating here. And I want to better understand, what is going on? How does belief happen so clearly for me in one sense and so differently for others? So it was interesting. I found it personally draining to do. I would want to do it for, forever.
But don't the adherents of, I've never dealt with 9/11 truthers. I've had a lot of experience with creationists, and I totally hear what you're saying about there being a huge amount of variation in what people believe. But they seem to talk a lot. Well, let me just use creationists as an example.
Okay.
They will contend, either the creationists or the intelligent design folks, they will contend that they have better evidence than evolutionists for,
Yes.
natural phenomena.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And ultimately the evidence fails because it's built on this very shifting sand of a series of preconceived ideas of history in this long history, and careful cherry picking of materials that support this particular point of view. Although in reference to your point, there is occasional argumentation among them about, not enough, but there's one creationist named Kurt Wise, who actually got his PhD in paleontology from Yale.
Wow.
Under Steve Gould. He didn't study very much of Steve, but Gould was on his committee, and so everybody else says, "Oh, Kurt Wise got his PhD," but Gould at Yale in paleontology, you don't really get a PhD. You're raised by wolves. You do the best you can. Eventually they push you out of the program, and but Kurt would actually go to creationist conferences, and he would contend with other creationists who were making mistakes about the Cambrian explosion, or about some other horse evolution, or some other aspect. And he said, no, that's not what the evolutionists say. These are the data. But he still is a young Earth creationist.
Yeah.
His view is that the Bible has to be correct.
Yes.
And therefore we just have to keep looking. And we just have to keep looking for the evidence that will show what we know is already correct. Now, I think the truthers are, from what and I'm not an expert, you know so much more about them than I am. It seems to me that they are looking for evidence in a somewhat similar way, in that they believe in this conspiracy that the government is, planned all this.
Right.
And I'm sure there's a lot of cherry picking of data. Am I correct?
Yeah.
But aren't they really concerned about evidence, however poorly they may go about assembling it?
Absolutely.
In
Oh,
their
yeah.
personal views.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yes. I mean, I remember having someone asked me when I was doing the research if I ever thought that some of them were making up evidence. And I said, no. I mean, it's that particular thing. Like these are very, very serious people, the kind of people who go to conventions, and this is a life, a life for them, and very, very serious. But the arguments tend to be about, so for example, there are people who think this is a controlled demolition. That's a very common thing. Then there are people who think, well, there's, no, there were actually, so the planes actually hit, but, there was, the government allowed it to happen, or there was, something else. Then there are people on the, the microwave people who think that there was no actual planes that hit. There's the hologram, these are sort of like, but even those are fringe people who,
even the truthers consider them fringe.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So there's, one particular woman who was a professor of engineering at Clemson University, named Judy Wood, who's very infamous about, she's one of the leading no planers, as they call them. There were no planes. And I spoke with her, and she's very intelligent. She's a, an engineer. She eventually lost her job or didn't get tenure or something along those lines. But, when I spoke to her, she asked me straight out, she said, you won't be able to, I want you to read, you'll have to read my book. She had a manuscript, but you won't be able to understand it. And I said, that's probably true, because I don't have that level background in engineering and physics and all that stuff. I don't have that. But that doesn't, at the same time, I thought, so she's looking at me thinking, how could you don't have enough evidence to make a judgment. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, you have this knowledge, much more than I do, but I don't think that you have what I would consider solid evidence. But I lacked the ability to sort of understand how to explain that, I mean, in a textbook, when you students get a textbook on an argument, it all looks so simple. Mm-hmm. You have evidence and you can evaluate it, and you can sort of weigh which one is valid, which one's not, which one's more legitimate.
Look at the logical relationships among the statements and all that.
And it looks so neat, and there's diagrams, and you think, oh, it should be so simple. And then you kind of get out in the real world and you think, what's happening right now? I don't quite know how to explain that, which is where I found myself at the very beginning of that project, really.
I'm concerned. I'm very interested in a variety of denialisms, if you will, not just the evolution and climate change, but in much of that work, it is clear that there is a pre-existing and overwhelming bias, whether it's emotional, whether it's political, whether it's religious, whether it's economic. There's some, what did Hume call it? A sentiment. There's a sentiment, an opinion, as it were, that reflects the values and very important issues to that individual, that seems to be keeping the fingers in the ears, seems to be keeping any attempt to provide, as Sunstein would say, more information from seeping in.
Yeah.
That said, I get very concerned when people like us who are working in this area, and there are many people who are struggling very hard to understand what is, how can we deal with this? If the idea is communicated well, facts don't count. evidence doesn't count. You may as well just take all the information and just chuck it because it's not important. Just wait for those people to die out or something, or be outvoted or something like that. I trust you. I trust you are not just, totally willing to give up with.
No, so this is something that's really important, and I mean, in my book, I go into this because I don't ever want to be. I'd never want to be one of those people who just says don't. I want to make a careful distinction between sort of debate, and I'm not anti-debate, but I want us to sort of, we have a limited amount of resources and energies, individually, collectively. We have those of us who are interested in this kind of thing and care about this. So there's a difference between response and debate. And I think sometimes we tend to think that debate is the only response that matters. And so we can think about it this way, that one of the things, a rhetorician who I like very much, a philosopher, talks about response as you can respond to the person in front of you. And we tend to think like that's the response. So like, you're my interlocutor right now, right? You're talking to me, I'm responding to you, but I'm also responding beyond, right? You and I are talking, but we're also,
there's these eavesdroppers out there.
We could do this just on our own, right? We don't have to do this on YouTube, but we're doing this on, YouTube because we're responding in a larger sense. So, I mean, this is a performative example of, I think, how we can think of response is, so, I've been following this Alex Jones trial. I was just listening to a podcast that broke it down today. And I was thinking, responding to his lies and the things that he allowed to happen are really important, but not just to him. The goal isn't to change Alex Jones's mind.
No.
The goal is the response is to the public. The public is what, and so because he's putting it out there, and so you can respond to him to say, hey, you're really doing damage in very serious ways, in all kinds of ways. Don't you see that what you're saying is wrong? This is factually incorrect. All these things you could say to him. And you may or may not change his mind. You're not going to change his mind. But that it's already out there. And so the response then has to be, let's respond to, that's why I kind of say, like, what is it doing? What is what is he going on to do? Well, he's going on to, kind of propagate this idea that the government is never telling the truth, that there are no real dangers outside of the government, that there's nothing else to worry about in terms of, and the same with 9/11 truthers is that one of the things that it never got through to me was that by not recognizing what actually happened on that day, you're denying something very important about, sort of world relationships that we have, recognizing that there are strong ideological context that we need to become aware of. What is the reason? Why would people get into a plane and kill themselves? What is happening? And we have to recognize that. And there's a history there. And by simply saying that, oh, the government's just trying to blah, 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 completely ignoring something that really needs to be addressed. And so, anyway, all of this to say that response, when we hear something like Alex Jones, you can, assuming you were like able to sort of reach somebody or an Alex Jones type person, you could do that. But what if we devoted our energies more to looking at, okay, what is this evidence doing and what is this referencing? Look at the bigger picture. So I don't know if that's a satisfying answer or not. But to me, it had a lot to do with resources and time and energy.
Oh, well, yeah. I don't try to persuade creationists either, but but I do try to reach the people that creationists are aiming for.
Right.
And we had at our recent SkepTalk conference that we held last month, we had a panel on denialism, and one of the speakers was John Cook. he's an Australian. It works at Monash and has done a lot of work on conspiracism. And one of the points that he makes is that their group is trying to inoculate, as it were, to sort of prevent these ideas from taking place by giving people the tools that they can use to evaluate information that comes in that might sound good, but which, if you look at the structure, if you look at what the evidence is doing, in one sense, this is compatible with your position. You may keep some of these ideas from settling in and causing the real destruction. Well, you and I could talk. I mean, I could talk to you forever, but we should really let other people have a chance to ask some questions. Rays and Smith seem to, not Raisin, but Rays and Smith seem to say that conspiracy theories are sort of a conspiracism for conspiracism's sake. Would adherents to conspiracy theories agree, or do they believe they're getting to the truth?
I think they would not agree, but for a long time I've always said, like, the worst thing that could happen to a conspiracy theorist is that everybody suddenly says, "I totally agree. You
win.
It's done. We totally believe," because something does come to an end, and
and at that point, you just go on to the conspiracy du jour.
You'll go on to something else, but if what a conspiracist says is the dream, right? That we have like total awareness, the end of all nefarious secrecies, QAnon, like everything comes to light, everything. Think of all the things that end. I mean, this is world building in so many ways. And so, you need to continue that because world ends in that sense. And so the action, that's why I like that quote so much, because they're talking about keeping the oscillation going. It seems like it's a perpetual motion machine, but you have to keep feeding it to keep going.
Or just QAnon as an example. When Trump did not call out, the storm, in January of 2021, the QAnon followers were set back. I mean, they were astounded. They didn't know what to do. I think they lost a number of adherents, but I would love it if some sociologists would interview these people before and after and just find out how many of them left the movement, how many of them just absorbed the next QAnon conspiracy.
Well, the thing about QAnon is that it hasn't really slowed down at all, but even so after,
it's just shifted over to
voting. And there's actually a lot of QAnon followers now who have turned on Trump. The thing about QAnon is that it can absorb anything. It is sort of like
an example of
the greatest of all machines, because it doesn't need anybody. It doesn't need Trump. It doesn't need QAnon. It has no head to cut off, so to speak.
The Hydra.
Yeah.
What's the next question, Jay? From Cindy, are there ways to pre-inoculate people when they are young to prevent conspiratorial thinking?
I mean, there's, I think yes, yes,
I hope so.
And I think, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to do it. I mean, I with my kids, for example, I'll talk about my kids. So, I'm very open about, certitude and certainty are good things to a point. I think when you find yourself starting to say, I am right on this and will never bend, maybe hear yourself saying that and thinking about this a little bit. And I'm speaking, part of that is I grew up in a very, very fundamentalist evangelical household where questions were not encouraged because it was a lack of faith. You're getting back to faith again. You're taking things on faith. but in such a way that questioning was a sign of some kind of lack of faith. And I found myself sort of pushing against it, which I think is why when I was in college, I was very attracted to this idea of rhetoric, which is all about like, there's no right answers. There's a million possible answers, and there's some answers that are, more effective than others, but there's no ever a single right answer, which means that we have to talk together and reason this out and figure it out. And that was very attractive to me from a very young age. Now, how do you do that with kids? I don't know about inoculation, but to me, it's more about when I teach my course, to undergraduates, we talk about that the term skepticism. I'm kind of an etymology nerd, so I like going back to the Greek.
Well, we're not offended.
that Greek term, the skepsis, part of the connotation of that is pausing, a pause in thought, and again, getting back to that certitude where you pause for a second, you'll come to some kind of answer, but you pause and you think, you reflect, and you listen. And that's not, I feel like we live in this era where we're expected to sort of have a response and a feeling and an opinion and a take on everything, that if you don't have one, that's a bad sign. And so we talk a little bit about like, what does it mean to say, like, could you imagine seeing somebody being interviewed, a talking head on CNN, and they're asked a question, they're like, I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. That would be so, you'll never be invited back again.
Well, that, of course, is one reason why scientists make lousy guests on shows like that. Because one of the things that we're very used to saying is, I don't know yet. Liz Ditz, thank you for your question. I'm wondering how this approach, looking at the sort of underlying assumptions in the content, the proof proposed the conspiracy theorists, proposed by probably the conspiracy theorists, is related to Lakoff's ideas around framing.
That's a good question.
Underlying assumptions and framing, interesting.
Yeah, it's funny because I do actually use, we read some of Lakoff's work on framing in the class that I do teach about, pseudoscience and conspiracy stuff. And yeah, I mean, sort of so here's a good example. I'm not sure, Liz. I don't know. I mean, part of what we look at in terms of framing is that, this is a pretty obvious example, but, how you frame something is going to shape how you think about it, right? And so if we can reframe things, sometimes that causes us to, obviously see things from a different way. And sometimes that can be very scary for people. Like, well, what if you... So just, what does it mean? Just a very, very basic example. What does it mean to say anti-choice versus pro-life? And is it scary? Would it be scary for somebody to use one versus the other, depending on how you feel, or, whatever it is? If it's scary to you, why not? Why do you choose? What is one doing for you versus another? So I don't have a good answer for that. I mean, the part about the sentiment, the underlying assumption for me really is about how it really is sort of about what's being referenced. So when I choose to use the term anti-choice versus pro-life, for me, I am doing it very consciously because, and I'm referencing something that, talking about me personally, I'm referencing something there. It's a political choice. And I'm doing it for a specific reason. And so it's not just about framing and how I see people, but there's a lot of other stuff there, especially for me right now. There's, and I've just recently shifted to using that. I had been, up until, a couple of months ago, I would have said, pro-life, blah, blah, blah. and I've shifted to using this other language. Why? There's a lot of anger that I'm referencing. It's a political decision. So, even the words that we choose to use is also referencing so much more than just sort of the contents there. And that's really it's really messy. So getting back to that textbook, like there's no diagram for that in any of the textbooks we get about argument and stuff.
Nadia Kamar asks, does age play a role in being more or less susceptible to conspiratorial thinking?
So there's a lot of really interesting studies done in conspiracy research happens in different academic disciplines. And it's all really interesting. So there's psychologists who will do stuff about the psychology of it. There's political scientists who will study sort of that end to it. There's people like me who study more of the discourse about it. But one of the things that I've seen from people doing like more like political science stuff, kind of the demographics of conspiracy theorists, is that there is no single overarching demographic. And so we tend to think, or at least people I know, and I would tend to think, oh, conspiracy theorists must be more right-leaning. And people said that's not true. Or they must be less educated. That's also not true. It's actually very surprising. Age, socioeconomic status, all of these things, it seems that
they're very weak correlations. I mean, there are some correlations, but they're not really strong ones.
Yeah, you can't predict necessarily. And some people are going to be drawn, and that's to me another interesting thing about QAnon, that it's brought together some very, very strange alliances that we wouldn't normally see. So we're seeing sort of very, very conservative evangelical Christians with very left tending wellness, wellness and sort of new age people making up the primary, demographic of QAnon. Those are weird relationships together. But at least I haven't seen demographics suggesting that age plays a role.
I think it would be hard to, I mean, for any specific conspiracy, you can probably find it, but not overall. Anyway, Vincent Jorgensen has another interesting question. Has anyone recently interviewed followers of Harold Camping? Speaking of interesting conspiracies.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if they're around. I mean, I don't know if his church at least still has a following. I'm not sure.
I don't know either. I'm sorry, Vincent. Neither of us have any information on that, alas. Ross Blocher, hi, welcome.
Yes.
Speaking of Ross and Carrie,
hey,
is there a critical mass effect in which a certain amount or type of disconfirmation finally overrides a false belief?
So this would be more like, I'm drawing from research. This would be sort of like the research that psychologists have done. And I would say, like, the research that I've seen about conspiracy theorists actually changing, or I know you're not just simply asking about conspiracy theorists, but it really is something that it's a personal effect, which has the most, it's not information. It's also the most effective is some kind of personal experience. You undergo an experience of something. So, in the last chapter of my book, I end up talking about one of the Sandy Hook parents. Last name is Posner, who really was one of the first people to go after Alex Jones and get him deplatformed. But he was a former conspiracy theorist himself. He says, I was sort of a consumer of InfoWars. I was kind of a consumer. I was this guy. And, suddenly he's in the middle of this crisis, and he's at the center now of, being called, saying you're part of a false flag. Your son, you never had a son, or your son didn't really die, and you're a crisis actor. And he describes the sense of like, I would have never understood. And he tried to launch this. He said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk to these people because I was one of them, right? So he had this online discussion board. It was a great idea where he thought, I understand these people, I can talk to them. And it ultimately just didn't work because, again, he's sort of getting cut into him. And he said, like, it wouldn't have worked for me either. This is a terrible personal experience of a massive scale. But it really does, I think, take something, because again, it's all about, what is this referencing? It's not always about the information. So it's kind of my point in some sense, like, you can give somebody a piece of information that disconfirms, and maybe they'll say, okay, fine, sure. I can get so much more. I can amass it, because the bigger part here is that, sort of like the Adorno study, if you just don't like Jews, then you saying, well, what about this? This confirms this point. You can either sort of like make it work for you, or you can just go, all right, fine, I'll get something else.
There are plenty of other things to plug into the gaps.
Yeah.
All right, my dear, thank you. This was a really fun hour. I just so appreciate your coming and spending this time with Bay Area Skeptics. This program will be streamed on the Bay Area Skeptics YouTube site for one and all to enjoy, not just those of us who were lucky enough to be here tonight and hear you and ask questions. I do encourage people to check out your book. It's got a lot of very good ideas in it. Let me do quickly. Jay, can I have that slide up, please? Quick note, if you want to see the talks, listen to the talks at last month's SkepTalk, you can still register for the conference and get access to the talks. They will be offline for at least 6 months, but if you want to see them in the next 6 months, and they're really worthwhile, it was a wonderful conference. Go ahead, go to skepticalcon.com, and for the nominal registration fee, I think it's $30 or something like that, you can get the preliminary information. And I'm very pleased to announce that we do now have a video from our missing Snopes lady, Madison Depovich, who was trying to broadcast her talk from the middle of the Pacific Ocean and failed. We weren't able to get her to speak, but we have her talk now, and it will be posted tomorrow. So those of you who did attend SkepTalk, you can check back tomorrow to hear that talk as well. And join us next month for the second Thursday of September, September 8th at 6:30, an hour earlier than our usual time. Our next SkepTalk will be given by the McGill University Office for Science and Society's Jonathan Jerry. The McGill Center's byline is separating sense from nonsense, and they do a really fabulous job. If you, as yet, don't know the McGill group, be sure to check them out because they do wondrous work. In addition to the work that Jonathan does with Joe Schwartz at McGill, he also hosts the Body of Evidence podcast, which is medically oriented, as you perhaps can guess, which you should definitely check out if you're not familiar with this. So join us next month, and I will encourage you to go to bayareaskeptics.org, go to Patreon, help support us in our effort to bring you these kinds of programs in the future. Thanks very much for being here today, and join us next month. Bye-bye.
Bye.